Again, I want to welcome everyone who has joined the Free the Slaves webinar. We will be starting momentarily at noon. I look forward to hearing from our speakers, and we will get started shortly. Thank you so much. Christina, why don't we go ahead and get started?
Great, thanks, Nikki. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christina Holder, and I am Corporate Public Interest Counsel at Lowenstein Sandler. And on behalf of the firm and the Lowenstein Center for the Public Interest, welcome to the first discussion in our Human Rights and Social Justice discussion series. We hope to host these events on a regular basis and to feature a variety of social justice issues that our attorneys and staff are tackling through their board service, pro bono, and volunteer work, and to really celebrate these contributions to the common good. In today's discussion, we commemorate National Slavery and Human Trafficking Prevention Month with Free the Slaves, a fantastic organization that works to eradicate slavery worldwide. Although you can't see it on your screen, we already have almost 50 participants. Others are joining, I'm sure. Based on the sign-up list, the group is truly international, spanning a few continents. And if you're joining from outside of the US, please feel free to let us know where you're from in the chat and we'll give you a shout out. Now I'll provide a brief roadmap of today's program. We have a lively discussion with leadership of Free the Slaves, divided into several segments. Each segment will end with an opportunity for attendees to ask questions using the chat function. Note that only panelists can see the questions that you type into the chat, and then panelists will answer questions from the chat at the end of their segment. We'll also reserve some time at the end for any lingering questions. We'll start with Dr. Timothy Patrick McCarthy, Harvard University Professor of Social Movement History and Free the Slaves Board Chair. Tim will contextualize modern-day slavery and answer the question, how did we get here? Then Bukeni Waruzi, Executive Director of Free the Slaves, will give an overview of the extent of the problem worldwide. Then Amy Wiwi, partner in Lowenstein Sandler's employment group and Free the Slaves board member, will discuss Free the Slaves' work and its model of freedom. We'll then go back to Tim to discuss the legacy of slavery in the United States and leverage points for social change. Bukeni will then discuss the global legal framework and key challenges in implementing the laws banning modern slavery. We'll conclude with Amy sharing a few ways that each of us can get involved. And with that, I'll turn it over to Tim.
Thank you so much, Christina. It's wonderful to be here with everybody today. My dear friend Bukeni Waruzi and Amy Wiwi, who are colleagues of mine and friends of mine in the organization Free the Slaves, which we're going to be talking about today. I'm just going to open up with a couple of quick contextualizing points before I turn it over to Amy about slavery and modern day slavery and how we got here. I think that so often when we talk about slavery or we hear the term slavery, we think about it in the historical sense. And many of us who are in the United States and who have American citizenship and have grown up here with the history of this country, so often our understanding of slavery is framed by the idea of what slavery was and our perceptions about what slavery was, a highly racial commercialized form of chattel slavery, one that grew to encompassing 4 million enslaved people prior to and leading up to the American Civil War. The American Civil War as a war that was fought principally over slavery. That was the chief cause of the war. But I think it's worth remembering that even though that is a particular history of slavery, a grotesque history of slavery cooked into the United States as a country, slavery as an institution in the United States preceded the birth of the nation itself during the period of the American Revolution. The first boatload of African people who were enslaved and brought to what is now the United States arrived in the shores of the eastern part of what is now the United States in 1619. So there was a decade or a century and a half or more of slavery as an institution in terms of its evolution, even before the nation itself took up the project of independence and constitution building and revolution. But one thing that I wanted to be really clear about is, even though we have a very specific and maybe American sense of many of us, the American sense of what slavery is, slavery has existed in every human society for as long as we have recorded history. Some form of slavery has existed in literally every part of the globe for as long as we have a written history of the globe, and that continues down to the present day. And so when we think about the staggering statistic of 40 million people enslaved in the world today, I think it makes sense for us to understand that there has always been slavery in some way, shape, or form with some type of vulnerable and enslaved people throughout recorded history. Right now, that figure of 40 million, and there are ways that we measure the number of enslaved people throughout the globe, and we'll talk more about that later on. That number is the largest number of enslaved people to exist in the world at any point in human history. And yet, relative to the population of the globe, it's the smallest percentage of slavery, of slaves and enslaved people as we've had throughout human history. And so there's both very bad news and also some more buoying news with respect to this institution. But it is a grotesque institution that involves a whole series of crimes against humanity. And even though slavery as an institution has changed over time, and it's looked different in different parts of the world at different points throughout history, there are certain elements of the condition of enslavement and the conditions of slavery that establish a kind of through line throughout history. We know that slavery and enslavement is a form is a crime against humanity, and and that has become clearer and clearer as the laws have progressed over time. We'll talk more about that as well. But the condition of slavery is essentially the forcing, the ownership of one human being over another, the forcing of one human being who is owned to do work against his will, usually with the use of force, fraud, coercion, or some other form of violence to keep that person, to enslave the person in the beginning, and to keep that person enslaved over time. Usually slavery involves some ideology and practice of supremacy and subordination, a kind of hierarchy of personhood and of labor and of violence that presumes that there is one group that has the right to rule or to own over other groups that are by ideology or understanding and practice at the bottom of any society's hierarchies in that time. Sometimes the ways that those hierarchies are constructed are racial, as they were in the United States, kind of black and white racial ideology, sense of white supremacy and black subordination. And in other places, those kinds of hierarchies and that kind of supremacy and subordination are understood in religious terms or socioeconomic terms or class or caste terms or other kinds of ethnic distinctions that people make to use as justifications for the system of slavery. This forced ownership, this forced fraud, coercion, and violence, the sense of hierarchy, supremacy, and subordination are through lines in terms of the condition of slavery over time. One other final point that I'll make before turning it over to Bukeni is that there are, in any given moment in history, a series of root causes of conditions and vulnerabilities that place people at greater risk for slavery, whether you're talking about war and conflict, forced migration, the climate crisis that we're experiencing worse and worse over time in the current moment, often a root cause of slavery. So there are many root conditions that put different types of people in positions of vulnerability that make it more likely that they may end up in the system of slavery and enslave themselves. And another final point, the one final point I make about slavery is that it's very, very difficult once you are enslaved to walk away, to run away, to get free. It is very, very difficult within the system because the system at its core is coercive and so often violent that it makes it very, very difficult for people to flee the conditions of slavery and to get free and to stay free. Though that is one of the central challenges of the abolitionist movement globally today, and that was always one of the central challenges of the abolitionist movement historically, which I'll talk more about in a little bit.
Thank you so much, team, and thank you so much, Christina, for the kind introduction. Nice to be here with many friends, of course, the chair, Professor McCarthy, and our dear friend, board member, Amy Wiwi. So I want first to thank the Lowenstein for organizing this. I think this is a very important event where we're going to share and really understand what is at stake in this kind of a global movement we are in. I like the way Professor McCarthy put this, reminding us the definition, what is modern day slavery. So if you look at the central piece is the coercion, the fact that, you know, under a variety of situations, one person is forcibly controlling another one or more for the purpose of exploitation. So this is, you know, as we try to analyze the scope of the problem, you know, I just wanted to remind you what modern slavery means. Now, sometimes, as our team explained, we may think that it is past. What that means, what again is still around? Yes, it's still around. It never gone away. It has just taken different forms and different proportions. In this kind of a more modern history, we have learned that there are many forms of slavery. They range from sex slavery to peonage, to forced marriage, to child labor, to bonded labor, and all of that. So those are really, you know, the kind of the forms of modern slavery. But how do they become? How really this becomes, modern slavery? So for example, you have different acts. You have to recruit someone, you have to transport someone, you have to transport that person, and another person has to receive that person. So you have quite a kind of a willingness to implement a whole plan. So which means it is not a kind of random act or random situation. It's carefully and well planned. And now how that is done, either sometimes as the definition reminds us, there's a threat or use of force. So there is a quite, a power dynamic that is there, coercion, sometimes abduction, fraud, deception. So abuse of power, or vulnerability of someone, but also giving payment, some inceptions. So those are kind of a means by which this act is committing. Now, for what reason? As I say, it can be exploitation. Of course, that includes forceful prostitution, other sexual exploitation, forced labor, slavery or similar practices. Nowadays we have a phenomenon of the removal of organs that are being sold from one place to another, and really many other types of exploitation. So as we understand this, let's kind of try to walk through a mapping. What are the numbers? One might ask, how many people are we talking about? Where exactly? Yes, the numbers are really staggering. McCarthy, gave us the statistic of 40 million people or under, who are living under, slavery. But that is a statistic of, by ILO, in the study they did in 2016, that was published in 2017. So it's been nearly 4 years ago. But almost last year we went into the global pandemic, and many statistics and the studies have shown that during the pandemic, slavery has gone up exponentially. When we talk, slavery, especially, for example, human trafficking, forced labor, child labor, those instances, has gone really, really high. So while we're talking about 43 million people in slavery, you won't be surprised that it may be even higher than that, because that study was a study of 2016 that was published in 2017. So now we are talking about even higher proportions of people that actually were in the slavery condition. For example, and this is spread across the world. There is no country, no nation, no community is immune from slavery. For example, in Europe and Central Asia, you have nearly 3.6 million people enslaved. In the Americas, over 2 million people. In Africa, you have nearly 9, really just below 10 million people living under slavery. In the Arab states, you have it is really, a bit over 500,000. And then in Asia Pacific, there is really a huge number of, around 25 million people, enslaved. So here we're talking something really, a phenomenon that is spread across the world. As I said, no country, no community, nobody, or really no nation is immune from this phenomenon. Now, the other question is, why this? Why slavery? Why these numbers? Not only because the conditions that McCarthy highlighted that can include climate, can include migration, can include conflict, all those phenomena. But in some ways, it's a very lucrative business. Statistics shown that for example, human trafficking ranks third in terms of illegal businesses profit, ranging just behind drugs and arms trafficking. So the third in line is human trafficking. So people are profiting a lot of money doing this kind of business. So for example, if you look by gender or by the demographic, you have nearly, for example, 50% of victims of slave or survival of slavery are in 50% of victims today are in labor, in forced labor. You have nearly, 37% are trapped in forced marriage, which is one form of slavery. Or you have 12.5% of people are trapped in sex slavery. And a really struggling number of 71% of these victims or survivors are women and girls. So here we're talking about high proportions almost across the world. And another struggling number is that 25% of of slaves today are under the age of 18 years old. So here we're talking about really the whole future is the one that is being damaged. So now you can imagine how the world will look tomorrow. So as we talk about how these numbers are, who is affected, the demography, but also we have to look to really give it a closer look in terms of what are the root causes of slavery. While it really flourishes where people are vulnerable in vulnerable communities. So poverty is one of the biggest challenges. I really like to quote the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who actually once said, addressing the UN Security Council members in 2017 when they were about to pass the resolution to 2388. He said that, quote, preventing the situation that lead to trafficking means addressing poverty and exclusion in line with the 2030 agenda for the sustainable development. So, addressing one of the root causes, which is one of the huge ones, is poverty. So, lack of economic opportunity, education, healthcare. Those are, part of, factors that of poverty that lead to massive, implosion of slavery everywhere. We also have gender-based discrimination that can lead. Corruption is one of the causes as well. The rule of law deficit. Of course, we'll talk more about that. In the other section in terms of the global mapping of the legal framework. But the deficit in rule of law really lead to massive cases of slavery, but also colonial legacies. As we know it, racism itself is a legacy of slavery is itself a legacy of racism. So let's face it and really look at all these factors. They are factors that we know. Of course, war is also part of it, and other things that Professor McCarthy said. But I think as we look at these root causes and really quoting what the Secretary General was telling the UN Security Council members, is that once we are able to attack or to address these root causes, it will lead to the eradication of slavery around the world. And that is what one of the things that Free the Slaves is really committed to do, to make sure that we really address some these root causes, to make sure once addressed will really help eliminate or eradicate modern slavery. And then also to remind everybody, as Christina said, this month is really January, the month of National Human Trafficking Prevention Month, which we do celebrate very well. But also let me remind also that this year, 2021, is the UN International Year for the Elimination of Child Labor. So we are dealing with, really, it is very significant that really we are talking about this, and then we'll have to take some action, because nobody is immune. But for us to make sure we can end slavery, it will require everybody's involvement. Up to you, Amy, or over to you.
I've got to unmute. Thank you so much, Bukeni. I'm not sure if this is a good time, but I think it might be interesting for everyone to hear about how you first became involved in this movement and your, the things that you've accomplished in your career, both with us and before you joined Free the Slaves.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think, thank you so much, Amy. It's been, sometimes when we talk slavery, I was one of those people who was thinking slavery in the old definition, in terms of slave trades, how we're taken from Africa and across the transatlantic agreement, all of that, or maybe under colonialism. But I came to work on this issue, as a result of war. I am from originally from the Democratic Republic of Congo, Eastern DRC. For many years, over two decades, that region has been affected by war that caused over many millions of people died as a result of the war. Huge number of women victim of rape and other sexual violence and conflict. Thousands of children were being recruited as child soldiers, and that is the exact one where I I thought to work on. Involved without me planning, went to try to help rescue some of the kids that were being forcibly recruited and taken into military and rebel camps and get training and then sent back to their own villages and communities to go kill people. So it was really a total, that really fits very well in the definition of, a forced coercion to cause damage into his own village. So some of these kids have been asked to kill their parents or do things that are unbelievable for a child. So I was able to get the courage of an activist, or all of us, to try to see how can I help, even though I couldn't imagine that by myself, I could have addressed this whole issue. So I started going into the militia camps, negotiate with the rebel commanders, and get some children back to the community. But where they're coming from, where the community, this community were very poor, no infrastructure. The war was really ravaging the little infrastructure that was remaining. So the hope for the future was really very minimal, very small. So I started getting some of these, but that was not enough because it was a cyclical. And you can see this in the slavery issue as well, if we look at terms of human trafficking and forced labor, etc. Once you take the child back home, there's nothing at home, and he's still going to be vulnerable to go back again because whether he has spent 2-3 years there, he was kind of brainwashed and find that this is my only life. There's nothing else. So getting them back, mobilize the community to accept these kids because they were very violent because they were trained to be violent, really violent, and then make sure that these kids are really so socially and economically reintegrated in the community was something that I did. But above all, that was not enough. You could see many still being recruited, all the parents being worried, and the war ongoing. So I thought to take the case to the International Criminal Court. That's where I felt in love with the global justice system because it was one of the situations where you are very desperate. You don't know where to go, how this can end. I am only one person. I have nothing. I'm not powerful enough to address this issue by myself. So going into the International Criminal Court, working with the Office of the Prosecutor, because that was the issue who I was working on was was under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court was a war crime, recruiting, enlisting, and enlisting, conscripting, and using children and make them participate into hostility was one of the biggest war crime ever. So the International Criminal Court had really the mandate to address that issue under the Rome Statute because it was a war crime that could not be tolerated as any way. So after so many sessions and working closely with the office, we finally got the conviction of a warlord in the DRC, where he was sentenced to 14 years in prison, and for war crime of enlisting, conscripting, and using children under the age of 18 into hostilities. So that was a great victory. But that doesn't mean the fight has ended there. So if it happened in DRC, you have many issues, similar issues of child soldiers in many other countries, such as in Myanmar or where you have many children being recruited and used as child soldiers. In Sri Lanka, that is also the other country. In Iraq, everywhere where you have the conflict, in Yemen or in Mozambique, I can go on and on and on. And in many countries where you have issues or issue of war and conflict, you always have these issues: children being recruited, women being sexually abused, and rape being used as a weapon of war. Like you have human trafficking at a mass scale, and that no one can monitor or control or put an end to. So those are kind of issues that I want, that you find in war situation. So I wanted just to share that story, see how, all of this is something that I think, will require courage and everyone involvement if we need to address it.
Thank you so much, Bukeni. That is, I think everyone really appreciates you sharing that. And this was something that was happening in Bukeni's home, in his hometown. And this happens everywhere. So thank you so much. I want to talk a little bit about the organization itself and what Free the Slaves does. And the organization was founded in 2000. We had talked a lot about having a 20th anniversary event, and then COVID hit. But we're so happy to be able to share with all of you the wonderful work that Free the Slaves is doing, and the magnitude of the modern slavery problem in the world today. So Free the Slaves is really very highly regarded as a leader of the modern slavery abolition movement. Our staff our U.S. staff is based out of DC, but we have programs that are strategically placed throughout the world in particularly vulnerable communities to address particular slavery issues that those communities face. So our mission is not only to free individuals from slavery, but changing the conditions in these communities at a grassroots level that allows slavery to persist. So, the first step would be really, identifying the issue and educating and mobilizing vulnerable communities to eradicate slavery. Many individuals in these communities, they don't understand either, sold their children or other folks into slavery, that they have a right, not, if we're talking about, bondage or because there's a debt or something like that, they don't, people don't understand, they don't know that they do not, that they don't have a right to enslave them or require that they, work off their debt. Individuals have a lot of issues really with their communities. So strengthening communities, mobilizing folks on the ground to eradicate, on a local basis is really, very important to our work. Of course, we also need, as Bukeni mentioned, to be able to reintegrate individuals into their communities, and ensure that they have the ability to sustain their life and their livelihood and meet their basic needs and those of their families. So we have our on the ground work that we're doing, and we can talk a little bit more about, where we are and what those programs entail. But, we also work very hard to strengthen the rule of law. As I think Tim mentioned earlier, slavery is unlawful in every jurisdiction, but it exists everywhere. And there's a real gap between the legal parameters and the enforcement parameters that really allow it to exist in a lot of communities. Police and public officials may turn a blind eye, or they just don't have resources to pursue these sorts of things. And so we do a lot of advocacy on the local level to identify these issues for law enforcement and to ensure that, people who see it happening don't, just civilians don't, permit it to continue or object. So, and then, obviously these communities that are suffering from significant poverty or other, lack of basic needs like healthcare, food, shelter, those sorts of things, will remain vulnerable no matter how many slaves are freed if we don't change the conditions on the ground. So this is really our, our model. And one of the questions that popped up in the chat is how we measure success in fighting the trafficking and slavery, either in these communities or worldwide. So I don't know if Tim or Bukeni, that's a question that, you can answer. I think it's hard, right? I mean, it's a difficult measure, but do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can give some examples. Yeah, of course, the definition of success might be looked at different angles. Sometimes, getting someone out of debt bondage will be a success, maybe 2-3 people. Maybe, passing legislation that criminalize, let's say human trafficking, that could be seen as a success. Advocating and being able to make sure survivors receive adequate services such as healthcare or education or kind of reintegration services. Those can be seen as a success. The key now is how to sustain that success. As I say, you can have those, but really addressing the conditions, we will be really one of the huge success that can be seen at a larger scale. Yes, one community may have 10,000 people, maybe 3,000 or 500 of them are under debt bondage situation. Yes, you can do that. Have issues with a situation where kids are being used, in the mining site in some of the country, in the Congo, etc. All of that can be done, but really it has to be a systemic change. So changing really the system will go along with with changing the conditions. So at Free the Slaves, we really we really like to make sure we can have people coming out of this out of the slavery, but we also want to make sure this success is actually sustained, and it can be it can be is sustained in the systems that have been changed, and those systems include the policy, to have a culture to fight against corruption, to an accountability system that is well implemented, where the legal framework works perfectly well. The cultural shift it can be also seen as a change, because some of these root causes include also social norms that go alongside with the definition of modern slavery. Let's say, for example, the issue around female genital mutilation. That is also another form of slavery, because it goes along with gender-based violence. So we, of course, we can talk in terms of how to do the metrics, how to monitor and evaluate the impact. But in general, those are kind of a very basic that I can share with you, how we possibly assess our success and how we go about it.
Thank you. So we are going to, I think we are going to move on at this point. I am going to discuss things that folks can do. I know we had a question that it sounds like we're doing, a lot of things at Free the Slaves. We really are. There's, both advocacy on the groundwork, advocating for change, and then enforcing of these laws. So we're doing our best, right? And we attack programs and communities on their own level. So to the extent we identify a problem in a particular location, we sort of try and solve the issue for that community. But you are absolutely correct that this is an enormous it's an enormous problem, and there's actually a lot of work to be done. We do partner with a lot of other anti-slavery organizations across the world to share best practices and information, and you know, even to partner on the ground. So that's how we deal with all these things. But I think we have to move on so we can get through all of our content here. I think Tim is next going to talk about national legal and policy framework. So with a historical perspective, you know, at least in the US, and the freedom gap. So Tim, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you so much. And
Tim,
well.
Tim,
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt. Before you jump in, I just want to read the CLE code for everybody who would like to receive CLE credit on your CLE forms that you were sent yesterday and will be sent in a thank you note. Please include the code 135048. Again, 135048. Tim, back to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks, Amy and Bukeni, for that conversation. I just wanted to say, Amy, to your question of Bukeni about how he came to the work, it's interesting because I came to this work in some ways because I'm a historian who has studied slavery and freedom movements. And one of the things that I stumbled upon in 1999, there was a book by Kevin Bales, who is one of what I call the quad founders of Free the Slaves. Free the Slaves had 4 founding members, and Kevin Bales was one of them. And he published a book called Disposable People, which was the first book-length study of modern-day slavery, what he named as modern-day slavery, and then the founding of Free the Slaves happened the year after that book was published. And so I actually came to my work with Free the Slaves through that book and through my friendship with Kevin, which is now over 2 decades. And one of the things that struck me was that I had spent most of my career and my time as a scholar and a historian studying the ways in which slavery has impacted the United States and been, as I said, kind of cooked into the books from the very beginning, even before the birth of the nation. And I also had spent a lot of my time, and still do spend a lot of my time, thinking about how freedom movements, various freedom movements, not just freedom movements against slavery or to abolish slavery, but other kinds of social justice movements that seek to advance rights and freedom and equality and dignity for all people, that I knew a fair amount about all of that, and yet had no idea that there was still this phenomenon of modern slavery, and that we're talking about tens of millions of people still in the 21st century who are experiencing slavery as an institution. And so this really shocked my own consciousness and made me kind of feel somewhat silly, frankly, for not knowing that this was still going on. And then I really tried to set out in my teaching first with my students and in my own scholarship and also activism to try to connect those dots. And actually, it's my involvement in the modern day abolition movement that has actually in some ways induced me and inspired me to try to connect the dots between the past that we know and that's on record with our present dilemmas and human rights challenges in the current moment. And so for me, that's really been a large part of this work. And then, of course, over time have gotten to know so many of the activists like Bukeni and so many of folks who have globally experienced slavery, who have come out of slavery, who are now powerful advocates for abolition. And that too was part of the larger history of the movement itself, that it is so often some of the most powerful voices and activists against slavery historically and contemporarily are people who have been through slavery and have come out of slavery into freedom. And I think about historically people like Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass and so many other members of the abolitionist movement who have been the most powerful voices for freedom and for equality that the world has ever known. And that is still true today of people who have liberated themselves and been liberated from modern day slavery. just thinking about the United States, because so often the ways that folks within the U.S. and even in the West more broadly, or in the global North, think about slavery is often in reference to the transatlantic slave trade, the hundreds of years of trafficking countless millions of people from the continent of Africa to the so-called New World, that kind of imperial, colonial, and slavery project that lasted multiple centuries and that influenced the histories of all of these empires, former empires, even nation states connected to that. And so the United States is very much implicated in that. One of the system of slavery that originated and evolved in the United States, its particular racial character of the subordination of Black people, the violence against Black people, the notions of and ideas and practices of white supremacy that created the hierarchies of a nation that from its very beginning both had slavery and articulated itself as a place where freedom and equality and rights and dignity were also aspirations and truths, self-evident truths. And so one of the things about the history of this country is that it's been a stunning contradiction, a violent contradiction from its very birth. And we can't escape that. We can pretend that it's not so. We can focus on the language, all men are created equal, and the self-evident truths of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that comes out of the Declaration and that flows into the Constitution and so much of our laws, and certainly our culture and our sense of ourselves as a nation. But we can't ignore the fact that those things always, right from the very beginning, coexisted with this brutal system of crimes against humanity, in particular crimes against Black people and Black human beings. Black lives have never mattered in this country the way they should, and the way that so often Americans like to claim that they do with their very lofty ideals and aspirations. And so it goes right back to the beginning. It's interesting because Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the draft of the Declaration of Independence, who wrote those words, all men are created equal, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, was himself a slaveholder. He was himself a white supremacist. You can read it in his writings, his sense of white superiority over Black people. And yet at the same time, he owned slaves. He was never able to free his slaves when he died because he was in so much debt. We know that he committed routine acts of sexual violence and rape within the system of slavery with Sally Hemings, which is one of the women that was enslaved on his plantation, right? So we know that Jefferson himself, right, the author of those words and ideals, was himself a living, breathing contradiction and violent perpetrator within the system of slavery. And we have to reckon with that as a nation. He was not the only one, right? James Madison, George Washington, so many of the founding fathers were people who owned other people, who committed those crimes against humanity. And yet at the same time, they were also the founding fathers and the revolutionaries who gave birth to the country. It's interesting how they wrestled with that, though. They wrestled with this contradiction mightily. It's in all of the documents. It's in the debates of the Constitutional Convention. It's in the draft of the Declaration of Independence itself, right? Jefferson actually included a grievance. The final grievance in his long list of grievances in the Declaration was in some ways kind of blaming the King of England for slavery itself. And yet it was edited out because John Adams and Ben Franklin and other members of the drafting committee understood that to call attention to this contradiction of the existence of slavery simultaneously with these claims of freedom and equality and rights was going to open the United States up in the midst of the context of revolution in the late 18th century for cries and claims truthful of hypocrisy. That the whole national project was built on a lie from the beginning. And so right from the very birth of the nation itself in the American Revolution, you have this stunning and violent contradiction at the soul and the core of the national project. And you also, at the same time, have this moment where slavery is starting to evolve and differentiate itself. Right from the Revolution, when the 13 colonies declared their independence, all 13 of those colonies had some form of slavery in them. It was only later on that each of what would become the northern states, those colonies that became states, started to pass gradual abolition laws at the state level that led to the eventual and gradual freedom of Black people in the United States in the North and the growing, deepening expansion of slavery in the South, which leads to those, I'm oversimplifying, but leads to those geographical and political divisions that ultimately sowed the seeds of division that ultimately inspired the Civil War. The original Constitution only mentions slavery obliquely 3 times. The Founding Fathers, again, understood that by dealing with it too much, by talking about it too explicitly, by cooking it into the Constitution with the language of slavery or of race, neither of which exist in the Constitution, that they would open themselves up and that the whole thing would get undone right from the very beginning. And so they punted in some ways. They only referenced slavery 3 times in the original Constitution, never by the term slavery, never by the terms black and white, but by other persons, such persons, people who are held in service. They're euphemisms for slavery and enslavement and slaves, and they only appear 3 times in the original Constitution. As freedom was expanding in the North and slavery was growing in the South, you saw emerging first in the northern states and then really nationally across the country, an abolitionist movement first inspired by African Americans themselves, free black people and fugitive black folks who found a small band of white sympathizers in the North, and they built a movement for social change and for freedom that really took place and evolved itself over the period of the first 60 years of the 19th century, again leading up to the Civil War. But it's not until the 13th Amendment in 1865, after the Civil War, after the 700,000 deaths, after the liberation of 4 million enslaved African American people, that you get in the Constitution for the first time a prohibition of slavery. And this is something that was happening in other parts of the world as well, in other countries too. It would take some countries longer, some were earlier. Britain, for instance, passed an abolition law later, Cuba or earlier, Cuba later on, and other countries have their own histories of this. And so we have over this period of time a movement that emerges to challenge slavery, which I think can offer us some really important lessons for how we today can sort of move to press levers for change when it comes to the existence of slavery, which I'll talk about in the next slide. And just quickly, let me just run down some what I call levers and locations. If we could have the next slide. Yeah, so for social change, right? We know that social change is a complicated project. We know that social justice movements do work tactically and strategically in a whole range of ways, in a whole place, in different locations, which become levers for changing society. The abolitionist movement worked on many fronts. It worked within the context of the law. It tried to rely on and call on existing laws to protect people who were vulnerable to slavery, or for people who were coming out of slavery, to protect them in their freedom. Also, it was a place where people could use the law to get free. And it was also the context within which abolition itself and the protection of those freedoms ultimately got recognized. And so the law becomes a really important location of social change. And as Amy, you said today, everywhere in the world, slavery is illegal. And yet there's a gap, a freedom gap between the reality of the laws on the books and what the lived experiences of people who are vulnerable to slavery and who are in enslavement are experiencing. The realms of politics and policy, the debates we're having in legislatures and parliaments and other political bodies is another realm, another location and lever for social change when it comes to abolition. And the abolitionists understood this, even though they were passionate outsiders who were not themselves, by and large, the elected officials, the presidents, the Congress people, etc. They pushed them, they worked with them, and some of them became them as a way to use politics and policy as a location and lever for social change. Every social movement needs to mobilize resources. Every social movement needs to raise money to do its work. Free the Slaves is no different. We have a $2.5 or $3 million a year annual budget. We have to raise that money. We have to mobilize those resources in order to fund that work and to do that work. And that's hard work to do, but it's part of the work of social change. And then, of course, there's the grassroots community organizing, which we saw throughout the abolitionist movement in the 19th century and which you see today. One of the things that Free the Slaves does is we work in communities all over the world, that we try to develop what we call practices of resistance to slavery and also practices of resilience when it comes to freedom. It's not just about eliminating the conditions that create slavery, or about liberating people from slavery. It's also creating communities that are resilient and resistant to slavery, such that freedom is not only possible, but sustainable. And then the last realm of social change that's really important is this realm of culture, of places where we tell stories, where we listen to the powerful words of people who have been through slavery, who have come out of slavery, so that we can begin to tap into people's emotions emotional and affective and empathetic dimensions and characters so that we can start to change hearts and minds. We can't just change the laws and the legislation. We also have to change people, the conditions that people live in, the circumstances that shape those conditions, and then ultimately their likelihood for being able to live lives of freedom and to change the culture, to change hearts and minds, to change the story we tell about ourselves, to remove and resolve those contradictions is also part of that work of social change. Bukeni?
Thank you so much, Tim. That was really wonderful. So Bukeni, I think, is going to talk a little bit about the global legal framework. And then I am going to tell you all at the end how you can learn more and get involved. So, and we will be circulating this deck to everyone after the presentation. So go ahead, Bukeni.
Yeah, thanks so much, Amy. And thanks so much, Tim, for that brilliant historical perspective on on the history of slavery and modern day slavery in the US. Now, as we look at all of that, looking into legal framework, but why legal framework? Because these are instruments that help address some of these issues on the justice and accountability level, and that is very important. Because if we do recognize that these practices are harmful, are bad, they should not happen, then someone needs to be held accountable. So what is that framework? So as we look at into this, the most referred to instrument, in terms of fighting slavery, of course, in this case, human trafficking, is the Palermo Protocol. That really the United States has been very instrumental in really getting it done. So though it is a very important instrument, but one of the problem you're going to find with these, protocols and conventions and etc., is that they are not, they are not really transformative. Meaning they have approaches that might not be, for example, victim or survival centered. They may not be gender sensitive. They may not have a kind of a human rights perspective with them. For example, with the Palermo Protocol, while it really establishes a clear mechanism to deal with human trafficking at global level for all the member states of the UN, however, you will find it really runs short on the issue around rehabilitation and the reintegration of survivors. So while you can address that, but still you have to deal with survivors. What happened to them once you put them in this mechanism? So while we can go one by one on these instruments, they are good, but they run short on some aspect that need to be taken into account. The other thing, so one can ask, we have all of these ranges of instruments. These are global. You have other of them, some of them are also regional. There are also others in country. So we're talking here about these, international mechanisms that are available, at local level, at national level, at regional level, and at global level. Now, what makes a difference? Why, even though we have all of this, but still we are still struggling with addressing effectively slavery issue? For example, you have issues around lack of political will. Everybody, this, slavery is one issue that is one of the issues that everybody agrees upon. It is bad. Everybody, whether you are from this country, from that country, everybody understands this is bad. Child labor is bad. Sex trafficking is bad. Sex slavery is bad. All of that, everybody agrees it's bad. But what do you do about it? What these laws or policies aren't working effectively to address that? Political will is almost non-existent. Everybody acknowledges that problem, but is not willing enough to do much. Corruption, corruption is one of the disease that really is harming any progress on all of this. International pressure, is difficult to put on some of these, some of these atrocities. slavery and, for example, human trafficking is a lucrative business. So people aren't really willing to let go, despite the consequences. Weaker policy implementation, as I said, and inadequate justice mechanism. Look, for example, in the United States, with all these mechanisms that exist, that Tim mentioned. Ask me how many people are brought into custody or into justice for these crimes. Very few. So I understand we don't have much time, but I could have given you the issues around kind of specific issues, for example, in country, whether in the DRC, where you have instances of child labor and forced labor and sexual trafficking into mining sites. Migrant workers in Qatar, in Qatar, 90% of the workforce is composed by immigrants, and you can understand the system of kafala, which is kind of recruiting workers, and where they first in human conditions in terms of pay and other things, or in Costa Rica, which is one of the countries where we will see worst forms of child labor. You have, for example, 54% of the kids in Costa Rica, for example, are working in services. Services that can range from hotels to commercial sex work. So we're dealing here with not only regional or global, but also in country problems. That's why I think this will need everybody to be involved. Over to you, Amy.
Thank you so much, Bukeni. I think we are actually out of time, but I want to let everybody know there are a lot of steps that everybody can take. So one is, learn more about slavery. Speak about slavery, inform other people that, this continues to exist. Free the Slaves' website has so much information. It should be so helpful to you. And, certainly if you have questions that were not answered that were in the chat, we'll try and reach out to you, because we should be able to find out who you are and at least have your email address. Or you can feel free to reach out to us. But there is a lot of information out there about organizations and consumer goods that are produced without slavery in the supply chain. And so we have a couple of websites here that, Done Good is great. Know the Chain, those are fantastic. And I think when you receive this, there will be links in here. So thank you everybody for coming today and for listening. I know people are dropping off quickly because we've scheduled an hour. We do have a few questions in the chat, so if anyone wants to hang on, we'll answer them, but everyone will get a copy of this deck and, who participated in the event today. So do you have a few minutes, Tim and Bukeni, to stay and answer some questions? Okay. One of the questions that we got is, when and how do we use the terms human trafficking versus slavery? Oh, I think you are muted.
Yeah. Just quickly, I think that oftentimes, in just a practical sense, people use the terms interchangeably, right? That they talk about trafficking and slavery and trafficking as if they're interchangeable. For me, I've always felt that trafficking is the sort of the activity or the action that is part of transporting people who are enslaved within the system of slavery from one place to another. So trafficking is the kind of means and slavery is the ends. But I think that, in very real practical terms, I think people often use them interchangeably. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which is the TVPA, which is a piece of legislation that was passed in 2000 and has been reauthorized 4 or 5 times since then, uses the term trafficking to set up in the State Department the Office of Trafficking in Persons, the TIP office. And so even that language of trafficking is still something that is very much part of the legal and legislative language that also addresses enslavement and vulnerabilities to slavery, and slavery as an institution itself. So they're very much related to one another. It's sort of like this slavery and the slave trade, right? In a more historical sense, that the trade is the trafficking of humans. Slavery is the larger system of oppression within which those people are enslaved.
Thank you, Tim. We had another question about, aren't there some shining examples even during the American Revolution of Blacks who were greatly appreciated by Washington and received freedom fighting the British? So that even the leaders of the time struggled with the view of racial supremacy because they had these personal experiences.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a long, deep history. In fact, many African Americans served were loyalists during the American Revolution. In the political terms of the day, they fought for the British because the British smartly used the prospect of emancipation and of freedom as a carrot to enlist Black troops to fight for the British side during during the American Revolution, and that was something that the Americans, the revolutionaries, had to sort of contend with. And so there were certainly lots of heroic acts on behalf of various military projects during the American Revolution by African Americans. And it's true that there hasn't been a war, I can scarcely think a major war in American history where it hasn't led to the expansion of Black freedom in certain ways, the liberation of people from slavery in the context of slavery in the 18th and 19th centuries, and then also expanding rights and freedoms, or at least the demand for more expansive rights and freedoms coming out of modern worlds like World War II. And so, sure, but the fact of the matter is that Washington only manumitted or liberated his slaves when he died. Jefferson never did, right? The people who were enslaved by Jefferson during his lifetime were still enslaved when he died because he was in so much debt he couldn't afford to free them. So the relationship of those founding fathers, of Washington and Jefferson and others, to slavery and to white supremacy and to slaves themselves or enslaved peoples is a very, very complicated one. But they did, to the point and to the question, they did wrestle mightily with these issues in their private writings and in some cases in their public writings as well. And the historical record shows not these kind of heroic, freedom fighting men, but of these deeply tortured, deeply conflicted and problematic human beings.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry we've run over, but this has been a really fantastic event. So thank you so much, Bukeni and Tim, for joining us today. And thank you, Christina and Nikki, for making sure this all ran smoothly. If anyone, I think on our next slide, we have some contact information for the three of us. You are welcome to reach out to us with questions, and we will be sending the deck out to everyone shortly. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.